On the way out, the United States continues to withdraw troops from Syria. We have a report and reaction, including what President Donald Trump said about Christians in the region. Impeachment investigation. Democrats continue their probe into the president's phone call with the leader from Ukraine. Synod on the Amazon. As the meeting enters its second week, some church leaders are urging Pope Francis to allow married men in the region to become priests. And the newest saints. The Holy Father canonizes 5 people, including Cardinal John Henry Newman. We're in Rome. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, October 14th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. President Trump announces millions of dollars in aid for Christians suffering in Syria. The announcement comes at the same time the president stands by his decision to withdraw American troops from the same region. Now the president faces criticism the aid won't be enough to help those who are left vulnerable. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. President Trump's national security team has been meeting here at the White House. They're following the fighting in Syria and considering possible sanctions. And the fate of tens of thousands of Christians hangs in the balance.
This week I directed $50 million to support Christians and other religious minorities in Syria.
President Trump says in total his administration has provided more than $500 million, partly to help religious minorities in the Middle East. Still, he is standing by a decision that leaves Christians in Syria even more vulnerable. He pulled U.S. troops off the border with Turkey, which quickly crossed over and attacked the Kurds, another U.S. ally. The fighting leaves nearby Christians in the crosshairs.
I don't think our soldiers should be there for the next 50 years guarding a border between Turkey and Syria when we can't guard our own borders at home. I don't think so.
At the White House today, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin said sanctions could be levied against Turkey, but admits it's a complicated situation.
Turkey is a full member of NATO and an ally of ours who is now fighting over border issues with the Kurds who have helped us with ISIS.
But Democrats blast the Trump administration and say Turkey's attack on the Kurds has caused irreversible damage.
And no sanctions after the fact will change the human rights crisis that he has caused at this very moment. None. No rallies or chants or tweets will bring back those dead children.
Republican Senator Lindsey Graham said he was meeting with the president today to encourage harsh sanctions against Turkey. Graham is normally one of the president's biggest supporters, but he said pulling the U.S. out of northern Syria was a big mistake. Now, the Kurds are forming an alliance with Syria to fend off Turkey's attack. Wyatt?
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. Joining us now with her analysis is Nina Shea, Director for the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute. Nina, welcome back to the program.
Great to be here.
As we just heard, President Trump has promised $50 million to aid in religious minorities in Syria. Will that help? Is that enough?
Well, certainly these minorities, religious minorities, have been trying to get back on their feet since ISIS. And they need jobs, they need training, they need humanitarian aid in the meantime. But the way it's phrased is that it's ethnic and religious minorities, the $50 million. So we're watching to see if it reaches the Christians. It could all go to the Kurds, for example, which is another minority. But more than anything, really, they need security. Mm-hmm. Who is to protect them? No one. The Kurds were protecting the Kurds, reinforced by our Air Force and our trainers and our special ops, were protecting the Christians. Our forces are now gone. The Kurds are embittered. I'm not sure who is going to be protecting the Christians. That's the immediate concern right now.
Okay. So obviously that means there's a lot of danger for the Christians if U.S. troops continue to withdraw. What does this mean in terms of the chances for ISIS reemerging?
Well, ISIS is there. There's some that are sleeper cells, and there's some who are emerging. There's some coming in with the Turks, we believe. There's jihadis coming in with the Turkish army, doing their fighting. And that's who they want to settle in that region, 2 million refugees, some of whom are part of the problem. Then there's the imprisoned, detained ISIS militants. Several hundred of them are reported to have escaped. And then there's 10,000 others of them still, as far as we know, in detention, and tens of thousands of their family members who are just as radicalized, also in detention camps. We have a fog of war. We don't really know what's going on. I work with the Antiochian Orthodox Church there very closely. They have an aid program there. And I know they have evacuated for now because it's unsafe right now. One of the first targets was an Assyrian Orthodox church in Kamishli, day one of the Turkish strike. So they struck a church there, St. George.
Wow, pretty scary stuff. And obviously, like I said, if there's a possibility of ISIS reemerging, it poses a danger to those churches. Switching gears a little, because I want to ask you while you're here, you also are following events in China. Late Friday afternoon, the Trump administration and Beijing declared a temporary truce in their trade war. What do you make of this?
Yeah, I think that China is in a holding pattern, want to keep the markets calm for now. And waiting to see how the American election turns out if they have to make a deal with Trump. They're not as afraid probably of his opposition as they are of him at this point. So we'll see.
Are you optimistic at all they can reach a deal, I mean, long term?
Well, I think there's a lot at stake so that they will reach some kind of deal, but it's they have to follow the rules and stop picking our pockets. The United States has now had its eyes awakened by the Trump administration to what has been going on with this transfer and this stealth of transfer of technology. And our high-tech industry is paying a price.
Yeah, and we'll continue to follow those ongoing negotiations between both sides and see what emerges. Nina Shea, Director for the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
A Republican congressman and top ally of President Trump says he was kicked out of a closed-door impeachment hearing on Capitol Hill. Representative Matt Gaetz says he tried to attend a meeting today where lawmakers interviewed the president's former top aide on Russia, Fiona Hill. Gaetz says the Democrats leading the hearing wanted him gone.
If Democrats really are trying to build a legitimate case, they would use legitimate tools. They would hold a vote on the House floor to establish procedures. But we continue to see this as the sham and the charade that it is.
Congressional Republicans and the White House are trying to press House Democrats to openly state their support for impeaching the president. One witness who may not be called before Congress is the still anonymous government whistleblower who touched off the impeachment inquiry. The United Kingdom and the European Union say they face an uphill struggle to pass a deal on Brexit before the deadline at the end of the month. UK Brexit negotiator David Frost arrived at the European Commission in Brussels today to resume talks. Officials from Britain and the EU have been meeting over the weekend. Some negotiators are hopeful a deal will be announced in the coming days. European Union leaders will hold meetings Thursday and Friday to discuss a possible deal. Tens of thousands take to the streets of Hong Kong today as part of a peaceful rally to promote freedom and human dignity. American flags filled the streets as protesters call for Congress to support legislation in favor of the former British territory. Hong Kong residents are hoping the U.S. can help provide a check on Beijing's influence over the city. Hong Kong is now in its 5th month of protests against mainland China. Pope Francis says he's praying for a peaceful solution to the unrest in Ecuador.
Specialmente a quelli provenienti dall'Ecuador.
The Holy Father says he's trusting the souls of those who have been killed in protest to the Blessed Virgin Mary. Ecuador was the site of nearly 2 weeks of violent protests. Today, the government announced a deal with indigenous people to end a planned austerity measure. At least 7 people were killed in the violence. The Vatican's longtime security chief and Pope Francis' main bodyguard has resigned. Officials confirm 57-year-old Domenico Gianni is stepping down after an information leak as part of a financial investigation. The Vatican says Gianni was not forced to resign, but chose to do so in order to avoid disrupting the investigation. Gianni has stood by Francis' side and jogged alongside his Pope-mobile during hundreds of public appearances and foreign trips. The high-profile Synod on the Amazon enters week 2. Several bishops taking part in the meetings are urging the Holy Father to allow the ordination of married men in the region to relieve the shortage of priests. Other topics have included the environment, evangelization, pastoral care, and the rights of the indigenous people. Bishop Francis Aline, Bishop of Georgetown, has been working in Guyana for the past 16 years. He joins us now from Rome. Your Excellency, at today's briefing, one of the bishops said that he supports ordaining married men. What do you think of that issue? Do you agree that this would be the best way to relieve the shortage of priests?
Well, I would tend to look beyond just the making up of numbers. Other things have been discussed by way of how to bring that presence of God's kingdom into our communities. And the ordained minister is not the only way. So it's good that this is a part of the discussion, just exploring possibilities. That particular one would, of course, have to go through a very thorough examination of tradition and the theology and so on. But I certainly don't dismiss it. I hope it can be included in the discussion among the various possible ways we can reach out to further be present to the people in the Amazon.
Very interesting. I want to ask you about your part of the region. What concerns from Guyana did you bring to the Synod discussions?
We share a lot of the concerns with the other communities as I've been listening to their concerns. One of the things that we have been experimenting with recently is providing or offering early education in the indigenous language to the indigenous communities.
What would you like to see coming out of the Synod that will help the Church form strong and vibrant families? I mean, are there any declarations or anything that the Vatican can do to help?
Well, I'm sure out of all these deliberations, those who will now take all these contributions and interventions to bring it together, hopefully there will be some guiding principles or some line of advice or recommendations that can be helpful to dioceses and to the faith communities. For example, one of the things that came up in one of our discussions was how do we learn to mediate and dialogue, an important word, dialogue with the society around us, with technology, with the politics, with the people who are exploiting the Amazon and sort of desecrating it. So we've heard some very interesting interventions of how that can be done. So it's non-confrontational, it's non-threatening, but trying to bring people's awareness to what is so very special about this part of God's creation.
Has Pope Francis been involved and engaged in the sessions, and how, if anything, he's participated in some of these discussions?
For the most part, he is present and he is listening. He did make a brief intervention and gave 6 points of areas he thought were important to look at. One of them was violence in the area. He looked at the role and the rights of women particularly, and so on. So there are a few things that he has just put on the table, inviting us to include it in our discussions.
Very interesting. Well, we really appreciate your being able to give us sort of an insight into the Synod and to the discussions. Bishop Francis Aline, Bishop of Georgetown in Guyana, thank you so much for joining us today and for talking with us about it.
Good to be able to join you.
Coming up, a push in the nation's capital to rename Columbus Day. Plus, how one of the newest saints is promoting dialogue between Catholics and Anglicans. Today marks Columbus Day, a federal holiday in the United States that celebrates the anniversary of Christopher Columbus' arrival in the Americas in 1492. But this year, in the nation's capital, there is no Columbus Day. At a city council meeting last week in Washington, D.C., officials voted to rename the national holiday Indigenous Peoples Day, a move that sparked debate. Author Jarrett Stepman writes in the Daily Signal, quote, "We are a civilization that admires those who push the limits of the frontier. The spirit that drove us west and in modernity to the moon is what we celebrate in men like Columbus." And Jarrett Stepman, who wrote the piece and is the author at the Heritage Foundation, joins us now with his thoughts. Jarrett, welcome back to the program.
Thank you very much.
What did you think of the D.C. City Council's emergency meeting to rename Columbus Day? And is this move limited to Washington, D.C., or are we seeing this elsewhere?
No, it's not just limited to Washington, D.C. In fact, you've had about a dozen states now that have gotten rid of Columbus Day, including many localities as well. And I do think it's ridiculous that the Washington, D.C., this is the District of Columbia, of course, is named after Christopher Columbus, can no longer celebrate this man. I do wonder how long the name of the city will even last.
You say Christopher Columbus did have some flaws and deserves some criticism. Explain what were those for people who are not familiar about what the controversy is, and why do you think, even though he has flaws, we should still honor him?
Yes, I think some people call him genocidal, things like this. I think that's based on a lot of bad history, quite frankly, and a lot of the things that came after Columbus. I think Columbus was, in many ways, a great explorer. He was a less great governor. Unfortunately, a lot of his crews, his Spanish crews, abused some of the natives that he came in contact with. He got criticized during his own time for rebuking the Spanish, who he sailed with, for mistreating many natives. And I think that's something that is often overlooked in our debates about Christopher Columbus. And I think he is a bold explorer that certainly is the reason why we have not just the United States, but countries throughout the Americas today. It was his trip, his exploration into the unknown that unleashed all of that.
Maybe you could explain a little bit more, because I mentioned in your quote about sort of pushing the frontier. What is it about that example that you think is important?
Well, I think it is important, of course, because it transformed world history. I mean, we're talking in this 500 years since Columbus's voyage, we've had so many civilizations that have popped up in the wake of that. I mean, his name, Christopher, was the Christ bearer, and he brought Christianity very much to the New World. And so much of the world that we know today was the product of Christopher Columbus, a man who sailed 3 vessels, I mean, barely 40 feet long, off into the Atlantic, complete unknown. The incredible bravery of this man at a time where, frankly, we didn't know much about the rest of the world, and certainly people in Europe had no idea that the New World existed at all. This is the man who did that, and I think for Americans, it's very important for us to celebrate that. We want to have our own bold explorers in the future. We want to push the edge of what we know, those new frontiers. That spirit of Columbus is very much in the heart of Americans.
And as you say, bringing Christianity and the church to the Americas was obviously very important for world history and church history as well. Do you think Columbus Day will eventually go away, or do you think right now, Jarrett, this is just a debate that we're having in this day and time?
No, you know, I think we're very close to losing Columbus Day. I mean, there was a recent poll that came out that showed that 70% of college students think that Columbus Day needs to go away. We're seeing that localities across this country are starting to get rid of Columbus Day. I think the younger generations in particular don't know why we should protect this man's legacy. They're often taught in many schools, especially public schools around this country, that Columbus is an evil man, that he produced terrible things, that ultimately the seeds that he planted led to terrible things. And so I think if a lot of Americans aren't willing to go back and defend Christopher Columbus now, I think very soon we're not really going to have any Columbus Day celebrated anywhere in this country.
It is a very interesting topic, and one that I'm sure will continue to play out in debates. Jarrett Stepman, contributor at the Daily Signal and author at the Heritage Foundation, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Up next, we go back to Rome for a look at the canonization of 5 saints, including Cardinal John Henry Newman. 50,000 of the faithful fill St. Peter's Square to celebrate 5 new saints, including the 19th century theologian and poet Cardinal John Henry Newman.
Che hanno camminato nella fede e che ora invochiamo come intercessori.
At the canonization Mass yesterday, Pope Francis said we can ask the new saints for their intercession, as they knew what it was like to walk by faith. Cardinal Newman is Britain's first new saint in nearly 40 years. He converted from Anglicanism to Catholicism in 1845. He became an influential, unifying figure in both the Anglican and Catholic churches. Kevin Turley, UK correspondent for the National Catholic Register, joins us now. Kevin, what exactly is it about this saint, Cardinal Newman, that we're celebrating?
Well, it's very hard to sum up quickly, Wyatt, but we're celebrating a life and a witness of nearly 90 years, which is still influencing the world today. It's influenced the English-speaking world greatly. It has influenced Great Britain greatly, and now probably will influence the Universal Church even more now that John Henry Newman has been declared a saint.
Well, just to follow up with that about his influence in Britain, why is Newman so important that the heir to the British crown was in attendance?
Well, I think Prince Charles being in attendance yesterday at the canonization, which is a rare event that a member of the British royal family would be here. He's also the Supreme Governor, future Supreme Governor of the Church of England, and yet he came to recognize the life and witness of John Henry Newman. He wrote a very interesting piece in the Observatore Romano where he described John Henry Newman as a great saint. This reflects the nature of Newman's life. Newman's life, 90 years, 89 years, was something which spanned equally part Anglican, part Catholic. He's owned by both parts of the British religious scene. Anglicans can see an awful lot in his early writings, which were very Anglican, and obviously then he was a towering figure in the emergence of the Catholic Church in the latter part of the 19th century. He is essentially a very English figure. There are many saints in different countries, some of which are through immigration. Newman was very much part of the English scene and is claimed very much by all British people, but in particular by the English, as their saint.
So then just to follow up with that, what do you think is the ecumenical significance, noting the fact that both Catholics and Anglicans can come together? Is this an example? Is this a figure now that will likely bring people together in the future?
Well, it was very much billed as an ecumenical event. I spoke to the British ambassador to the Holy See just on Saturday, on the eve of the canonization, and she was very clear it was very much an ecumenical event. However, having spoken to many of the pilgrims here, many of whom started out as Anglicans and are now Catholics, largely through the influence of John Henry Newman. Although it is an ecumenical event, many Catholics do suggest that John Henry Newman's path and his search for truth led ultimately to the Catholic Church. So that's what many were here celebrating, the fact that he found his true home in Rome.
Very interesting, and obviously something that people will continue to discuss for decades to come. Kevin Turley, UK correspondent for the National Catholic Register. Thanks so much for your analysis.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Finally tonight, it was a busy weekend for Pope Francis. He presided over the canonization and is part of the Synod on the Amazon. But he also found time to weigh in on the National Football League game. Sort of. The Holy Father accidentally sent a shout-out via Twitter to the New Orleans Saints football team. His message was about the newly canonized saints, but he used the hashtag Saints, which automatically tags the football team. New Orleans won its game yesterday against the Jacksonville Jaguars. And New Orleans Saints fans say they're happy their team received a blessing from the Pope, even if it wasn't intended. And that wraps up our newscast for tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.